name is Nick, and I'm going to be talking to you about psychological recovery following a traumatic experience. So trauma is really common. Over 70% of people will experience trauma at some point within their lives. That's an estimate. Of those who experience trauma, 78% are expected to experience it before their 25th birthday. The median age for experiencing your first traumatic event is 17. So some of you are due your first one soon. And of those of you who experience trauma, over 50% are going to experience more than one. I would say that I have experienced 2 traumatic events within my lifetime. One happened 5 years ago, and the other one over 15. Both of them have affected me in similar ways. Both of them continue to affect me to this day, although one experience has had more of a significant impact on my life than the other, and it's about this one that I will talk. As you can see from the statistical estimates, I am not special or unusual in having had traumatic experiences. In fact, it's almost certain that there are people in this audience who will have experienced a traumatic event. Your parents, your siblings, your other relatives, your colleagues, your teachers if you are a student, your friends, and maybe even you. And if you haven't experienced one yet, there is a good chance that you will do one day. Now, whilst I will talk about my own personal experience, I first want to talk about what the existing literature says, because some of you might be wondering, well, what is trauma? So examples of traumatic experiences include experiencing natural disasters, war, all types of abuse, serious injury or illness, car accidents, the unexpected death of a loved one, or being the victim of a crime. Although any event that a person finds distressing and threatening because it causes extremely intense feelings of fear, helplessness, or horror can result in psychological trauma. Therefore, what constitutes a traumatic event is somewhat individualized, because what one person finds traumatic, another person might not find as traumatic. However, all types of trauma, regardless of how traumatic or non-traumatic they are to others around you, can have an impact on the structure and functioning of the brain, can result in long-term difficulties within your daily life and mental well-being. Somebody who has experienced a traumatic event is often called a trauma survivor. And those trauma survivors may experience post-traumatic stress symptoms, such as flashbacks of the event, disassociation, which is when one becomes disconnected from their memories, feelings, or the sense of themselves. You may experience avoidance of the things that remind you of the traumatic event. You may have difficulties remembering certain types of information, which is why I have a stack of cue cards. I've got 34 cue cards. You may have difficulty recognizing and managing your own emotions, and you may have difficulties connecting with others. It's been found that trauma survivors can seem unemotional and cold to other people because they have difficulty connecting with them, showing warmth and affection, and they also have difficulty trusting others. It's very common for trauma survivors to experience depression and anxiety, and in fact it has been found that trauma survivors experience a heightened response to stresses. So basically what that means, if you take somebody who's experienced a trauma and somebody who hasn't, and you subject them to the same stressor, the person who's experienced the trauma is going to be more stressed out than the person who hasn't. It's also been found that trauma survivors experience more false alarms. That is, they recognize a threat when actually there is no threat. The brain areas affected by trauma are the same brain areas that are implicated in mental disorders such as depression and anxiety, and therefore people who've experienced a traumatic event are at a greater risk of being diagnosed with a mental disorder, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, also called PTSD, clinical depression, and clinical anxiety. These three disorders have a lot of symptom crossover, and they frequently occur together within trauma survivors. Depression and anxiety are common mental disorders amongst many different populations, and it has been estimated that the lifetime prevalence of depression and anxiety, that is the percentage of people who will experience one or both of these disorders at some point throughout their lifetime, can be as high as 50% within the general population. The lifetime prevalence of PTSD has been estimated to be 8%. However, it has been found that anybody who's experienced a trauma but hasn't been diagnosed with a mental disorder can still experience changes in the structure and functioning of their brain. They can still experience all the post-traumatic stress symptoms that I've described, and they can still experience long-term effects on their daily life and mental well-being. The low lifetime prevalence of PTSD diagnosis compared to the relatively high lifetime prevalence of trauma experiences may be due to the fact that signs and symptoms of trauma often go unrecognized by medical professionals and individuals alike, which in my opinion makes recovering from trauma a more long and drawn out and difficult process than it could be. Recovery from psychological trauma has been broken down into 3 stages. The first stage is establishing safety. The second stage is the retelling of the trauma, sometimes called remembrance and mourning. And last stage is reconnecting with others, sometimes called reconnecting and integrating. Basically, in the first stage of your recovery, your mind and body protect you from the trauma you've experienced by repressing it until you are in a situation where you are ready to confront and deal with what's happened to you. The duration of this stage varies with the individual, but one thing that is common to journeys of trauma recovery is that you will not move to the second stage until you are safe. And that is not just physical safety, that is mental safety and financial safety as well. Okay. When I think about my recovery process, and with the benefit of hindsight, I would say that the first stage of establishing safety lasted approximately 10 years and largely passed me by. And I think that there are 2 main reasons for that. Number 1, that's exactly what's supposed to happen during the first stage. My mind and body were doing everything that it needed to do in order to protect me until I was ready. And when I look back, I realized that I just didn't have the capacity to begin to confront and even start to deal with what happened. And secondly, I didn't know what a traumatic experience was. And I didn't know the effects that trauma could have on somebody over a period of time. And I had even less of an idea of how one would recover from trauma, what that would look like, or what that would even feel like. And I realize now that I was just so underprepared, and I firmly believe that that's had a negative impact on my recovery. During the first stage of my recovery, particularly in the first few years following the traumatic event, I wasn't experiencing any post-traumatic stress. I wasn't experiencing any post-traumatic stress symptoms that I was aware of. Now when I look back, I realize I was experiencing such symptoms, but I didn't attribute them to the traumatic event. And on reflection, this is because I wasn't fully aware that I'd experienced a traumatic event. I knew something bad had happened, but I didn't consider it to be traumatic. And I think that this is because I didn't understand the effect it would have on me and the effect it would continue to have on me. And whilst I could remember what happened, my memories were purely factual. The mechanics of the event, if you like, not the feelings and the emotions that went with it. To be honest, I thought what I'd experienced wasn't that bad, and I thought everybody went through it. But now, and I didn't think that it had affected me, and let's just say that I was in quite a shock. As time went on, the transition from the first stage to the second stage was gradual. There was no clear definition between the end of the first stage and the beginning of the second stage. What happened is that my symptoms just changed over time, like really slowly. The most significant symptom for me was the vivid flashbacks that I started to experience, because it was at this point that I realized something was wrong. And I used to think that this is when my recovery actually started. But now I realize with what I know about how somebody recovers from trauma, this was actually me moving towards the second stage. But at the time, it did not feel like progress. During the second stage of recovery, your mind and body force you to confront what happened to you and process the impact. And this second stage is sometimes called Remembrance and Mourning, and this name really resonates with me because it is exactly what happened for me. The flashbacks and other symptoms that I experienced slowly became more intrusive and more impactful on my daily life. And at their peak, I had no control over them whatsoever. And I was struggling to do very normal things, like get up and go to work. And I recall remembering more clearly what happened to me, and I recall that feeling of realization when I worked out exactly what had happened. And what followed then was a period of mourning where I experienced anger and sadness in a very similar way to the way that you might experience those feelings when you are going through the grieving process after somebody close to you has died. And I did feel a very heavy sense of loss. And I sometimes do feel a sense of loss, but it's not as intense as it was before. The thing I have found as I have recognized, accepted, and processed what happened to me is that there are levels of remembrance and there are levels of recognition, and therefore there are levels of loss. For example, I had come to terms with what had happened to me and that I accepted I experienced a traumatic event. And I was actually in a pretty good place, and I was starting to rebuild certain aspects of my life. And one might have said at that moment in time that I was in the third stage of recovery. But then what actually happened to me, my slides are going ahead. But then what actually happened to me is I started to recall some of the things that I'd done and I felt after the event. And I started to realize why I did those things and why I felt those things and how it was connected to the trauma that I had experienced. And then what would happen is I would grieve for those losses. And I felt like I was going backwards, or at best I was stagnating. But then I noticed a change, just like before. I realized that I was recalling and realizing things that were not specifically related to the traumatic event, and I had become more focused on how the trauma I had experienced had impacted my life and the people I care about and love. And I realized that this was actually progress, but not as I thought it would be. I thought my recovery was going to be like this, nice and neat, steady, progressing from one stage to the next. and not going back. But what actually happened was more like this. Like, choose first. It was more like this. You can see it's green at the top because initially you think that you're totally fine, and then the colors start to blur and you start to realize that actually you are not fine, and then you start to begin to process what happened to you, and you get to a point where you accept that part of it and you think, okay, I'm done now, but you're not done. And eventually you cycle back round, and you'll find that what happens is that cycle kind of moves down the column. So everything sort of gets less intense as you go along, and as you move towards the third stage of recovery. Now, the third stage of recovery seems to be all about rebuilding your sense of self from a place of acceptance. And I say seems to be because I'm not 100% sure that I've actually fully achieved this. But I'm definitely on my way. And I just feel like I'm going to continue these cycles as that cycle slowly moves down the column. And I'll continue that until I've recognized, accepted, and processed everything that I need to. But what I have noticed as time has gone on is that these cycles are beginning to fade. They're less frequent and they're less intense. And they've gotten shorter. And I know that one day they're going to end and never come back. Given that it is almost certain that everybody will be affected by trauma in some way within their lifetime, be it whether you are somebody who experiences a traumatic event or whether you experience it vicariously because somebody you care about experiences it, I feel like we're all going to be touched by it in some way. And for that reason, I feel it's important to share what I've learned in the hope that it will help someone, even if only just one person. So here is a summary of what I have learned so far. Number one, you cannot control your recovery. You cannot control when you will enter each stage and when you will transition between the stages. Your body will do it when you are ready. However, you can be prepared for it. And I feel like if I had known what was going to happen to me and understood that it was completely normal, it would have helped. And it wouldn't have been so scary, because there were times that I felt like I was going crazy. I didn't really know what was going to happen. Secondly, if you don't tell anybody about the trauma you've experienced, nobody is going to know. And unless your post-traumatic stress symptoms are particularly bad, probably nobody will notice them. And even if they do notice them, they're not going to understand why you're experiencing them. So doing what humans do, they will take that information and they will use it to make a bunch of conclusions about you as a person. And you just got to let that go. You can't control that. And I think the reason why people do this is because everybody is dealing with something, be it a trauma they've experienced themselves or something else. And other people just don't have the capacity to take on somebody else's stuff. They don't have the capacity to recognize what is happening and accommodate your struggles. Which brings me to the last thing that I've learned, and possibly the most important thing, is that recovering from trauma is really, really hard. And sure, there will be people who help and support you along the way, but your recovery is going to be ultimately something you do by yourself and for yourself. And your recovery process will be long, and it will be full of twists and turns, and it will be like a bumpy road. But eventually, the condition of that road is going to get better, and it will start to even out, and it won't be as bad. And you don't have to be defined by your traumatic experience forever. So here is all the reading that I did for this talk. Thank you for listening.